My name's Philip Jenkins. I'm with the History Department and the Institute for Studies of Religion. My colleague here, Tommy Kidd, also from History Department, Institute for Studies of Religion. And one of the pleasures of working in a unit like ISR is that we have the ability to invite people to speak and invite rising talent. And people who are going to be the historians and scholars you're going to be hearing a lot about in years to come. Our speaker today is Kevin Lowe. Kevin got his bachelor's degree from Cornell University, his master's from Drew University, that was religious studies and biblical studies. And in 2013, he completed his doctorate at Penn State on, let me see, Baptized with the Soil, Christian Agrarians, and the Crusade for Rural America. And a short time after that, and if you know anything about graduate work and doctoral work, an indecently short time after that, he published that as a major book with Oxford University Press. And since just a couple of months back, and just recently, he had the unusual honor of having the cover story in Christian Sanctuary, which is a big, influential magazine on that same topic. So I'm delighted to have Kevin as our guest here today, and I won't say anything about the topic specifically. I'll just hand over to Kevin and just say how delighted we are to have you here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Dr. Jenkins, for that introduction. And I'd like to thank the Institute for Studies of Religion for bringing me here. It is a real treat to be here at Baylor. Being an independent scholar and an introvert is kind of a lonely existence sometimes. And for those of us who are not employed in institutional settings, it is nice to get to have a chance to be here among the community here, get to talk a little bit about my work. What I want to talk about today is the role that Christianity, and especially Protestantism, has played in a major transition in American society, a transition that is not typically thought of as having much of anything to do with religion. That transition is the transition that turned farming in America into an industry, that turned agriculture into agribusiness. What my book tries to show is that that transition was not guaranteed. It was by no means assured. And that for much of the 20th century, it was American Protestants who led the fight to try to stop that change from happening. They did so not simply because they were conservatives, not simply because they were afraid of the future. They tried to stop this change not simply because they were uncertain about their own status going forward, but they did that because of some major theological commitments that they held about agriculture, about the nation, about what it meant to live the good life. And ultimately, those commitments led Protestant agrarians to treat the earth as a holy place. Everything else that they did flowed from that conviction. That's what I want to talk about today. So in other words, when American Christians first started to make a concerted effort to think about their role towards the environment, they did so to protect agriculture and to protect farmland. So I want to start by talking a little bit about that transition, what exactly happened with American agriculture in the 20th century, how we got to where we are today. So where are we today? When most Americans think about agriculture, if they think about agriculture at all, I would venture to say that they probably have certain images in mind of what a typical farm is like. This might be one of them. In much of the Central Plains in the Midwest, this type of central pivot irrigation agriculture is extraordinarily common. You can see a few buildings here in the front, but not a lot else besides these irrigated fields, which are irrigated by machinery. They're automated. They don't require an individual to be out in the fields directly engaging with the land. You might be able to see maybe there's some houses in the distance, but there's not a lot of evidence of people in this kind of image. It's an agriculture that is based upon an economy of scale, these giant tracts of land. It's an agriculture today that is heavily dependent on machinery. It's heavily dependent on government subsidies. It's in large part controlled by corporations. If you've seen the movie Food, Inc., there's a book called Foodopoly, which is about all of the corporate connections and interconnections in agriculture. We have a lot of farms in the United States that look like factories, that look like industries. You might think about CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, where much of the nation's meat is produced. Again, a very industrial picture of what it means to raise animals, to raise crops, to produce food for the nation. What's missing from all of these images, well, one of the things that's missing, are farmers themselves. And that might not be surprising given that today only about 1% of Americans are actually classified by the census as being farmers. So many Americans are much more removed from the processes of agriculture, that most Americans don't see these things happening. These statistics might be changing a little bit today with things like the sustainable agriculture movement, the organic agriculture movement, things that are bringing young people back into farming. If those numbers are changing, they're changing slowly, and it's only a drop in the bucket compared to the predominance of industrial agriculture. But what's interesting to me about the language that we use is that this style of agriculture today is typically referred to as conventional agriculture in opposition to something like organic farming. But we've tended to forget that what we call conventional agriculture is really only about 100 years old. It's really only after World War I, really in the 1920s, that American farming starts to turn into this, that starts to become an industry. That process speeds up, certainly after World War II, but we're still talking about a relatively recent phenomenon. It's just become so widespread that farming has become kind of an esoteric topic for a lot of Americans. We just don't see this, and we don't have to think about it very often unless we go out and search for it. So again, it's the 1920s that are really the catalyst for changing farming in America from a very localized, small-scale phenomenon into a major corporate, business-focused industrial model. So how exactly did that change happen? Well, in the first 20 years of the 20th century, roughly from 1900 to 1920, agriculture in the United States is booming. These are the peak years of productivity for American farms. Between 1900 and 1920, almost 1 million new farms are started in the United States. The overall gross income of American farms doubles in those 20 years. The average farm triples in value between 1900 and 1920. There's international demand, there's national demand. American farms are putting out just tremendous quantities of commodities. But at the same time, there's also some changes happening, and as the popular song from World War I put out, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris, after they've been enticed away by things in the city? And there were some demographic changes that were going on at the same time as farms were booming in prosperity that started to make a lot of Americans somewhat uncomfortable. In 1900, 60% of Americans lived in rural places. They either lived on farms or in rural villages, places of fewer than 2,000 people. By 1920, despite all of the growth that was going on in American farming, less than half of Americans were now living in rural places, and maybe only half of those, maybe only a quarter of Americans, were actively involved in agriculture by 1920. So already in those 20 years, there's a major shift where farming is booming and farming is becoming a lucrative business to be in, but there are fewer and fewer people actually involved in that business. World War I really brings an end to those boom years of agriculture. During the war, the needs of the military, the needs of countries overseas had contributed to these tremendous incomes for American farmers, had driven up production, had driven up prices. But after the war, the demand for those commodities began to drop off. Prices began to fall precipitously very soon after the war ended. And this presented American farmers with something of a quandary. The prices were falling, so they either needed to cut back or they needed to sell even more to make up for the falling prices. And the latter situation is what the majority of American farmers ended up doing after World War I. Production kept steaming along at the same rates as during the war and before the war. Prices continued to fall, and the country was faced with massive agricultural surpluses that couldn't be sold for reasonable amounts of money. When you have huge surpluses, it only drives the prices down further, trapping farmers deeper and deeper in debt. Farmers had borrowed tons of money during the war to expand their operations. That's a problem after the war. So for much of rural America, the Great Depression really begins in 1920. The 1920s are a terrible decade for American farmers, long before urban America really starts to experience the pressures of the Depression. You know, it's not the stock market crash that really begins the Great Depression for most of the country. So we have demographic changes, financial changes that are affecting American farms, and a whole host of very material changes. Like I said, the Industrial Revolution starts to really come to American agriculture in the 1920s. Things like tractors and combines become cheaper, more accessible. Farmers buy millions of automobiles in the 1920s. Companies begin to pitch consumer products to farmers, encouraging them to try to catch up with their urban counterparts. Radios, telephones, kitchen appliances are all marketed to farmers very strongly, beginning in the 1920s. In the 1930s, the Roosevelt administration makes a great push to extend electrification in the countryside. Many farms in the United States still didn't have electricity by the middle of the 1930s. Farmers are using more pesticides, more fertilizer, producing more on contracts with major corporations. The whole landscape of farming really starts to change in the 20s and 30s. So what's the problem? The problem is that all of these changes, economic, social, financial, demographic, all of those changes led, in many people's view, to a moral decay of the United States. Because for so long, so many Americans had looked to farms to be moral beacons for the nation. There was this long entrenched notion that growing up rural, growing up in the countryside, would contribute the most to your character. It was the best way to preserve democracy by living in the countryside, being a farmer, owning your own land. The farmers were expected to be the moral center of the United States. And as agriculture began to become more industrial, and as more and more people began to leave farms in the United States, many people also started to worry that the people who were left in the countryside were becoming more backward, were becoming morally compromised by all of these changes. People start to talk and publish a lot about what they call the rural crisis at this point. That the countryside is changing, this moral beacon is dimming. What are we going to do about this? Well, there's a couple basic responses that people have. One is simply to go with it, embrace industrialization, embrace corporatization. Another is to promote country life, encourage people to stay on farms, but try to change the way that they do it. Try to reform country life a little bit. Try to uplift it to make it more progressive. Bring some urban culture to the countryside. There's a country life movement in the early 20th century that tries to do this kind of thing. They talk about improving country schools, building more roads, bringing in speakers and creating discussion societies in the countryside, trying to encourage people to have a more urban-style social life in rural communities. But one major response, or another response to the rural crisis, is what I write about, and that's agrarianism. And the term agrarianism meant and continues to mean a lot of different things. It can mean everything from a reactionary, anti-capitalist, back-to-the-land mentality of trying to avoid the modern world completely. It can also mean just sort of a soft focus, fuzzy romanticization of country life. But today, agrarianism means largely what the Christian agrarians that I write about meant when they used the term in the 20th century. They meant that the rural economy should be based on family farms, should be a place where people don't have to fight against corporate behemoths. They meant an economy that was based on a small scale, a human-centered scale. Again, the family farm, even industries had a place in the agrarian economy, but they needed to be small. They needed to be community-focused. And agrarianism meant a life that was devoted to place, a life that was devoted to stability, to a sense of home, and a sense of devotion to that home. The intention of keeping people where they grew up, where they had roots, where their family had been for generations. This is really central to the agrarian vision. This is a movement that still exists today, and I think we're actually coming back into something of an agrarian moment today. The works of writers like Wendell Berry are extremely popular. He writes about all of these types of issues. The popularity of farmers markets, community-supported agriculture programs, the whole philosophy of eating local. These are agrarian values. These are absolutely core manifestations of what agrarianism means. Small-scale lives devoted to a specific place, knowing that place intimately, knowing your neighbors intimately, and living within that local circle. Although it may seem strange to a lot of us today, for most of the 20th century, what was going on with agriculture was really a matter of national concern. People agonized about this rural crisis. People from all walks of life talked about this, wrote about this, worried about this. And for much of the 20th century, the loudest, the most well-connected, the most influential agrarians to talk about the rural crisis were Christians, and especially mainline Protestants. So who were the Christian agrarians? The Christian agrarian movement begins as something that tends to be called, or they tend to call themselves, the rural church movement. And just to give you a sense of the sort of breadth of this movement, in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, most of the large denominations in the United States begin to open these departments of church and country life, department of town and country, these bureaucratic mechanisms to think about what's going on in the countryside. The Presbyterians are really the first to do this in 1908, but other Protestant denominations quickly follow suit. And a lot of these divisions do fairly bureaucratic things. They carry out surveys, they do sociological studies of their own denominations to figure out where their denominations are weakest, where they need to invest the energy to keep rural churches afloat. They worry very much about an overpopulation of churches in the countryside. Communities that used to be large and strong that have lost a lot of population now might have a handful of churches in the same tiny little village and not enough people to go around. And so these Protestant denominations in the early 20th century are worrying about how to keep their churches alive in the countryside. But agrarianism, and especially Christian agrarianism, was much more than just this bureaucratic, institutional, organizational phenomenon. It really was a broad theological and social movement that lasted for much of the 20th century. Many Christian agrarians worked in ecumenical settings, explicitly trying to reach across denominational lines in things like the Home Missions Council, the Federal Council of Churches, the National Council of Churches. They worked in regional organizations. They even worked in international organizations like Agricultural Missions Incorporated and Church World Service, trying to think more broadly about the role of rural churches and the development of agriculture around the nation and internationally. Typically, agrarianism, in keeping with the focus on the local community, it was a very local phenomenon, and it's hard sometimes to make generalizations nationally about the movement. It was often a matter of churches and denominations working together in whatever the best way was for a particular local community, trying to promote farming, trying to make farming seem like a religious vocation in order to keep rural communities together. They had a couple of main goals that in general most Christian agrarians would have agreed with, and these are in keeping with the general themes of agrarianism. They were absolutely committed to the viability of the family farm. Again, these are not Christians who are trying to stop the modern world from happening. They're not trying to take down capitalism. They want to convert the corporate economy into a diversified economy of small-scale, family-operated farms. They do want to rebuild the rural church. They want the rural church to be at the center of the local community. And to do that, they start to look for opportunities to provide ministers with better training so that they can minister to their congregations better. We see a lot of churches forming partnerships with state universities, universities of agriculture. They do things like provide summer schools for ministers to come to the state university, take some summer courses in agriculture so that they can go back to their congregations and understand the farmers in their local communities better. Churches train missionaries to go specifically into rural places, again with this agricultural mindset, in order to keep rural communities from decaying any further. Again, in a lot of places, they look for ways for churches to cooperate, again, across denominational lines. They think about new structures like federated churches, union churches, cooperative churches of all kinds. They rethink the experience of worshiping in a rural church, and this is a church program from a church in Ohio celebrating Rural Life Sunday in 1955, which was an extremely popular observance that caught on with Protestant and Catholic churches that was intended to provide a whole worship service oriented around rural themes. You have a prayer of thanksgiving for earth and crops. You have the creed of the soil conservationist, pastoral prayers. There would often be hymns with rural themes that congregations would sing. So agrarians wanted to keep communities intimate, and they wanted to have agriculture always present in people's minds, even in church, even while worshiping. And especially, as the creed of the soil conservationist suggests, Christian agrarians wanted to promote a stewardship of the earth, what we would now, in many cases, recognize as environmentalism, although they don't use that word. They wanted to keep creation close to people in their daily lives. They wanted people to be aware of creation and of their responsibilities toward creation. All of these goals are always intertwined in various ways. because agrarians believed that people and the land were always entwined. Communities and their surroundings were always intertwined. There is no rigid separation between people and the environment that just suggests surroundings of people. The agrarians are talking about a unified, holistic experience of life and creation. All of these goals, all of the things that they try to do rest on certain theological assumptions, and that's what I want to explore here. One theological idea that Christian agrarians talk about constantly is this notion of the abundant life. And one of their absolute favorite Bible verses, which they quote constantly, they print constantly on nearly every pamphlet that you can find produced by an agrarian, will have John 10:10 on it, when Jesus says, "The thief cometh not but for to steal and to kill and to destroy. I am come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly." They don't mean by the abundant life what prosperity gospel preachers today mean by it. They don't mean simply an accumulation of goods and wealth and power. What they mean is abundance in quality of life, if not quantity. Christian agrarians meant farm productivity in perpetuity, what we would recognize today as sustainability. Again, they don't use that word. But they want farms to be productive forever. They don't want the soil to be exhausted. They want people to be able to live on the land without wearing it out. By abundance, they mean family. They mean large families. They mean families that live in proximity to previous generations. They mean community. They mean a closeness to God in daily life, in the experience of creation. And they mean an enriching church experience. All of these things that they thought of as characteristics of the abundant life or the good life, they saw as jeopardized by industrial agriculture. And there were particular challenges for the church, again, in rural places. A 1923 study found that over 2/3 of rural churches in America could not afford to hire a full-time pastor and needed to share ministers. If there was no regular pastor, then there wasn't really a regular congregation in some cases. That might affect the community. That might affect family life, so on and so forth. Family farms would encourage large families. You needed children to work on the farm. It taught children about the dignity of work. It encouraged neighbors to work together. When you had small family farms very close to each other, you would still have neighbors, even in the countryside. And family farms were a way to oppose tenant farming, which agrarians also thought was a challenge to this notion of the abundant life. If you did not own your own land, it was much less likely that you would have any devotion to that land or want to stay there for very long if you were simply renting, or if you were a sharecropper, the worst of the worst. Their devotion to communities as part of this notion of the abundant life is a key part of the Christian agrarian theological vision. And it's part of their commitment to building a very visible kingdom of God on earth. And that's the second major theological focus that I want to talk about. Although agrarianism was a very worldly phenomenon that was dealing with very practical, everyday considerations, it rested on concrete beliefs about the end times. In many cases, Christian agrarians were keeping alive into the 20th century old 19th century notions about the redemption of society. After the Civil War, many American Protestants had become premillennialists, which simply means that they believed that the second coming of Christ would happen before the 1,000 years of prosperity that was promised in Revelation. And so they generally expected that the world was going to get worse until the second coming, that its corruption was essentially insoluble. We see a sort of new wave of that mentality in the middle of the 20th century with the rise of fundamentalism. But at the end of the 19th century, liberal Protestants tended to be post-millennialists, which meant that they thought the 1,000 years of peace and prosperity was going to come before the second coming. And so they believed that society could be improved and perhaps even perfected before the second coming of Christ. These are people who adhered to what's known as the social gospel, this belief that society could be improved by the church, and that secular institutions could partner with the church to produce this social improvement. And although in a lot of cases it would be difficult to label agrarians as liberal Protestants, they maintain this form of the social gospel in a rural way through much of the 20th century. They remain committed to this optimistic view of society and of their role in society. By putting the church first, by putting the church at the center of communities, the church could act as leavening for society. And the agrarian notion of the kingdom of God was a very real, very visible notion, a reality that could be experienced in the present, not only in the cosmic future. And one of the best examples of agrarians trying to bring forth a very visible kingdom of God on earth is a social movement called the Lord's Acre movement. It has its origins in the Great Depression South, comes out of North Carolina primarily, where especially in the mountains, farmers were having an extremely hard time getting products to market because of the terrain, and prices were plummeting anyway, so it might not even be worth it if you could get there. And so a lot of congregations in rural places, especially in the South, were having trouble keeping their churches afloat, having trouble paying the minister's salary, having trouble making repairs on their church buildings. And so the Lord's Acre movement is a way to try to keep those churches afloat. And it was intended to allow members of the congregation to contribute to the church from the resources that they had at hand. If they didn't have cash on hand, they at least might have farm products on hand. And so each season, people would be encouraged, and it's a little hard to see this picture here, but it's a family standing around with a basket full of potatoes. People would be encouraged to pledge a section of their farm as a Lord's Acre, and whatever grew in that section when it was time for harvest would be donated to the church. They would be brought in a ceremony. The church could either use that produce directly, could feed people in the congregation, or more commonly, the church would sell that produce and then put the money towards whatever was most needed in the church budget. But it was a way for people to take an active role in contributing to their congregation and to do it through their livelihood, through their work. People could choose to raise a certain number of animals and select a certain pig in this case, a certain cow, a certain number of chickens, as the Lord's Acre pigs, Lord's Acre cows, etc. These folks here are from Franklin, North Carolina. John Shepherd is an AME Zion member. His wife was a Baptist. This was a phenomenon that caught on in churches all over the South in all number of denominations. It really begins in the 1920s in Georgia. In South Carolina, there are a few sort of experiments in this way. But it's really in 1930 in Asheville, North Carolina, that the Lord's Acre really catches on and starts to be promoted. Constant promotion of these Lord's Acre projects helped the movement grow rapidly. Farmers would be encouraged to put a sign on their property showing off that they were participating in the Lord's Acre and come to church. In 1930, there were 6 churches around Asheville that used this plan. There were 50 the next year, there were 100 the next year, there were 300 the next year. There were thousands of churches all over the country by the end of the 1930s that were using the Lord's Acre plan to help keep churches and congregations afloat. Magazines and periodicals nationally began to pick up on this, began to promote the movement. This is an article from Reader's Digest from 1941, I think. The Saturday Evening Post ran an article on this in 1946. And the movement, especially the Farm Federation in North Carolina that really promoted this, generated a tremendous amount of print material promoting this movement. This is just from one of a typical Lord's Acre pamphlet. The family project is spiritually unifying, a daily reminder of God on the farm. You can see a sense of the type of language that the Lord's Acre movement used. And people did all kinds of things with this movement, and churches did all kinds of things with the money that they earned. Here's just another example from the American Baptists, what the Lord's Acre did for this church. There's just volumes and volumes, masses of material on this movement. Churches could use the money for wiring their churches for electricity, making repairs, paying for new paint, buying new furnaces, repairing damage, drilling a well. Just to give you a sense, from Powell Butte Christian Church in Oregon, when they held their first Lord's Acre movement in 1947, at harvest time, the church took in 315 sacks of certified seed potatoes, 300 sacks of commercial potatoes, 1 purebred Guernsey heifer, 2 tons of wheat, 2 tons of barley, clover seeds and hay, 2 fat steers, prime calves, 6 feeder pigs, ducks, chickens, and geese, for a total sale of $5,968. But again, people could do any number of projects, large to small. And it was a movement that got the attention of national leaders. In 1935, in the midst of the Depression, the Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace, who's second from the left here, visited Asheville, North Carolina to praise the Lord's Acre movement. He believed it was going to be the start of a great revival of spiritual regeneration. And this is an image of one of these ceremonies at harvest time where people would bring in their products, bring them up to the front of the church that would be decorated with sheaves of wheat and corn and all kinds of other agricultural products. Proponents of the Lord's Acre believed that they were standing in a long biblical tradition by doing this. They looked back to the Old Testament. They looked back to the Israelite feast of Shavuot, the feast of the first fruits, where in Exodus 34, the text reads, "The first of the first fruits of thy land thou shalt bring into the house of the Lord thy God," where the Israelites would dedicate the first piece of the crop to the temple. And it's the exact same mentality here with the Lord's Acre. They believed, proponents of the movement believed that one of its benefits was the fact that it brought people together. You could do this communally. Churches reached out to 4-H groups. This is a 4-H club from North Carolina to do Lord's Acre projects together. It encouraged children to become active members in the church. The plan could be tailored to things that children could do, like raising animals. This is little Alice Peterson of Mills River, North Carolina, with her Lord's Acre ducks. And I found this in the archives. I really hope this was not a Lord's Acre project, but it did not have any explanation, so I'll leave that with you. Proponents of the Lord's Acre believed that for all of its very material and very immediate benefits, they believed it was a contribution in this development of the kingdom of God. They were convinced that they were fighting some kind of spiritual battle against the modern world, at least the modern world in its atheistic forms. The leaders of the Lord's Acre movement were horrified by World War II. They were horrified by fascism and Nazism. They believed that the United States, if it would embrace Christianity, could be a leader against fascism and domination because of this commitment to freedom. But they believed that the kingdom of God was always bigger than the nation. It was rooted in the local community, but it would expand out spiritually into the rest of the world. And they also believed that one of the best things about the Lord's Acre was the ability to be a partner with God and all of God's creations. Being close to creation, maybe too close. Working with God's creatures, working with God's earth, was a way to really have a true partnership with God. The agrarian kingdom of God was a visible kingdom. It was marked not by, or not primarily by, evangelical faith or subjective experiences of salvation, but it flowed from the way that people lived. And just to go back to this pamphlet, the phrase down here at the bottom is a great example of this. A farmer who, with members of his family united with his church, explained it this way: "When we looked out day by day and saw the crop which we were giving to the Lord, we decided that we should give our lives to the Lord." And this is the mentality that they had. If you lived right, if you acted right, if you practiced right, then faith would follow from that. And that could be a reciprocal experience, but the way that you lived was first and foremost. Partnering with God led agrarians to see themselves as caretakers, stewards of the earth. And today, Christianity seems maybe to be waking up again to environmental activism. And a lot of Christians talk about stewardship today. The Pope's recent encyclical is a great example of this. But there is this longer history of environmental stewardship, especially among American Christians. And it's the issue of soil conservation and agricultural land that really first galvanizes American Christians' interest in environmental protection. And this is one of the other biblical phrases that is absolutely central for Christian agrarians. Psalm 24, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein." If the earth was the Lord's, and they took this very literally, then everything that grew out of the earth was holy and needed to be treated as such. Things like the Dust Bowl shocked Christian agrarians, that a catastrophe of this size could happen in the United States in the 1930s. And in 1939, a scientist with the federal government named Walter Loudermilk writes a document called the 11th Commandment, which catches on hugely among Christian churches. And it's a document that should be well known today, I think. It deserves greater attention. And this really sort of sums up the Agrarian Creed. Loudermilk wrote, "Thou shalt inherit the holy earth as a faithful steward, conserving its resources and productivity from generation to generation. Thou shalt safeguard thy fields from soil erosion, thy living waters from drying up, thy forests from desolation, and protect thy hills from overgrazing by thy herds, so that thy descendants may have abundance forever." There's that notion of abundance again. And so denominational leaders, Protestant churches, begin to call attention to the issue of soil conservation, that things like the Dust Bowl were possible because people didn't take care of this soil, because farmers were not treating the soil the way it needed to be treated in order to stay healthy forever. And so again, we have a huge volume of print, people talking about these issues. This book, Building the Kingdom of God in the Countryside, Rapkin says, "This is God's earth, and we are stewards of the treasures hidden in the soil. Farmers will be conscious of the fact that they are co-laborers with God, stewards." You start to see religious articles showing up in scientific journals. This is from a soil conservation journal in the 1950s. You start to see scientific language showing up in religious journals. There is no clear separation between religion and science on this issue. Farm practices could have a real significant effect on the health of the soil. The contrast here between a sort of denuded landscape on the left, again, it's kind of hard to see, but a healthy landscape on the right. The health of the soil was linked to the health of the church, linked to the health of the rural community. And churches begin to observe a holiday called Soil Stewardship Week in the 1940s, another example of these observances for churches that were intended to draw attention to these issues, in which preachers were intended to preach on rural topics, to talk about soil conservation, to encourage the farmers in their congregations to take seriously these responsibilities as stewards. And just to give you a sense of this, from a 1954 sermon by Reverend Biggie Spears in Simmsport Baptist Church, Simmsport, Louisiana, he said, "Man in his present state is bound to the earth, for it was from the dust of the ground that God formed him. His first job was to tend a beautiful garden, which God had planted with his own hands. His first food and clothes were from the trees of this garden. God's promises and privileges do not come without responsibilities. The soil is God's trust to man. If he treats it well, it will serve him well. We cannot please God and preserve our nation unless we are faithful toward the soil we till." And you see this type of language all over the country. Churches from all denominations, Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, etc., etc. And this is just an advertisement for Soil Stewardship Week. You can see promoted and sponsored by all of these local businesses. And this is another church service from Soil Stewardship Sunday at a Methodist church in Tennessee. Again, you have rural-themed hymns and prayers. The message on the right about today is Soil Stewardship Sunday. We possess two vital and related concerns. One is our soul, the other our soil. And this connection that Protestants always make between the land and their spiritual selves. So decades before the environmental movement caught on to these issues, soil conservation had emerged as a partnership between churches and the state. Soil Stewardship Sunday is something that is promoted by Cooperative Extension, by the National Association of Conservation Districts, the Soil Conservation Service, in partnership with local churches all over the country. And they continue to be essential protection mechanisms today, these conservation districts. Churches continue to quietly preach about these issues today. So when American Christians first began to cooperatively organize to protect the earth, they did so in the United States to preserve agricultural land and agricultural communities. The agrarians today, continuing these legacies, build upon this history. And again, I think we're coming into something of a new agrarian movement, an agrarian moment today. It may not be as visible as it once was. It may not have the national attention that it did at a time like the Dust Bowl. But the mainline Protestant denominations still have a whole host of rural organizations and departments and bureaucratic mechanisms. The National Catholic Rural Life Conference talks about these issues in the Catholic vein. The Lord's Acre movement still exists, especially in the South. You can find Lord's Acre sales every spring. Congregations still celebrate Rural Life Sunday, Soil Stewardship Sunday, all over the country. Creation care literature can be found in almost any Christian bookstore. And organizations like Habitat for Humanity, which most of us probably associate simply with building houses, come out of this agrarian movement. Habitat for Humanity was founded at an agrarian intentional community in Georgia in the 1940s. In all of these movements in the past and today, Christian agrarians hold tightly to the collective memory of creation and what creation means. The soil was God's creation. The land was God's creation. Creation was God's gift to humankind. After all, again, in Genesis, God creates Adam out of the soil itself. But soil needed to be cared for. To agrarians, the creation story was a reminder that God's original plan was for people to live in that garden and tend the soil. Things had changed, but they believed that by living right, by acting right, by practicing right, they could recapture some of that experience of the rightful place of humanity. So Christian agrarians encouraged farmers to take seriously their responsibilities to the land. They encouraged churches to take seriously their responsibilities toward people living in rural areas. Ultimately, they made the case to the nation that the land and its people had everything to do with the future of the world. And those legacies, I think, are worth remembering. Thank you.
In the 30s and 40s, do you have any sense of why Wendell Berry does not include the church any more than he does in his fiction? Because he writes of this period in most of his novels and short stories, that the church plays such a marginal role in Berry's fiction.
In his fiction.
Any ideas about that?
That's interesting, because I've never read any of his fiction. I've read a lot of his essays and his nonfiction work, and he is sort of the archetypal Christian agrarian today. But having not read any of his fiction specifically, I'm not sure that I can speak directly to that. But even in his nonfiction work, I think Berry doesn't incorporate as much of this historical legacy as he could.
Nonfiction work.
Yeah.
But it just almost it's really marginal. So I just wondered about
Yeah, that's interesting, and I should go pick up some of those novels and see what I think.
I just have one non-scroll related question. In your book, you talk about so many interesting individuals, and here you're focusing on the ideas, not the individuals.
Right.
Talk a bit about Liberty Hyde Bailey.
Yeah, Liberty Hyde Bailey was a plant scientist in the late 19th, early 20th century. He lived to be 98. He had an extremely long career. But he's one of the ways that I got interested in this topic, because in the early 20th century, the scientist Liberty Hyde Bailey, who was at Cornell University, was a public intellectual writing about agriculture, but writing about politics and writing about all kinds of other topics. But he was really a wide-ranging public intellectual. One of his best books, and the book that he's probably most remembered for, is a book that he wrote in 1915 called The Holy Earth, in which he laid out his vision of exactly this sense of responsibility to the earth. He took very literally the notion that the earth was holy, and so that everybody, no matter what you did, no matter what your occupation was, you had a responsibility to treat the earth as divine. He himself was sort of ambiguously a Christian, so he's coming at it from a slightly different angle, but his book is hugely influential for the churches that I study. They're looking back to Liberty Hyde Bailey constantly. That book has just been republished in a nice, inexpensive edition, so it's absolutely worth reading because he's at the heart of this whole movement.
I believe you said the introduction was by?
And the introduction is by Wendell Berry in that edition. So he's somebody who deserves to be much better remembered. But the Christian Agrarians are very much borrowing that language of the holy earth from Bailey. Yes?
Thank you so much for your talk. I learned a lot. My question has to do, though, with the characterization of the movement that you're describing as Protestant.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why the question occurs to me is there's been a lot. You mentioned the National Catholic World Life Conference, right? And I know that recently there's been quite a bit of historical work on the National Catholic World Life Conference, similarly sort of uncovering, related themes to those that you're writing about. Churches all across the United States. I mean, it's quite extensive. The roots of this, of course, can be traced to like Rerum Novarum, the 1891 encyclical of Leo XIII, and the National Catholic World Life movements in Europe and in England and so forth. So I guess what I'm wondering is, in your research, did you come across, you spoke about humanism, did you come across any connections between this sort of movement, with the agrarian movement within Catholicism, and the agrarian movement within Protestantism?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Catholic wing of agrarianism has just as long a history as the Protestants that I'm looking at. In many cases, they do kind of operate on parallel tracks, I think. There are times when they cooperate. There are ways in which they talk to each other. For the most part, however, they do kind of work independently. When you start to get into their ideas, they look very similar. the Catholics, like you say, draw on some different influences. These Protestants have no interest in the pronouncements of the Vatican, but essentially they end up in basically the same place. They do agree in a lot of ways. I focused on Protestants in my book largely because they had more connections with the government, with other secular organizations, and the linkages between churches and things like cooperative extension and 4-H and the federal government are really critical for what the Protestants are doing. The Catholics don't have access to government and some of these organizations in quite the same way. Had they cooperated more, maybe they could have had more of an influence. But for the most part, from what I've seen, they kind of stay on separate tracks. Yes.
Kevin, can you speak a little bit about the relationship between these early Christian agrarians and the growth and expansion of land-grant colleges and agricultural universities, which in many ways were instrumental in the development of what would become industrial agriculture and these ways? How are they involved with these land-grant colleges in the early days and as these grow?
There absolutely are connections. The connections are a little bit later in time than when the land-grant system really kind of gets off the ground. Initially, land-grant universities in the late 19th century, they do absolutely contribute to the trends toward industrialization. They tend to be blamed, even by scholars, for contributing to agribusiness and being, solely in favor of this corporatization. But beginning in sort of the 1920s, agrarianism starts to sort of find its way into the land-grant system. These efforts to provide training for ministers, these happen in land-grant universities, Cornell, Penn State, Wisconsin, Michigan, South Dakota, et cetera, et cetera. Land-grant universities at the time start to create programs for missionaries, overseas missionaries, to come back to the United States, take some courses in agriculture at the university, and then head back to their mission fields. In some cases, that does mean bringing this kind of industrial mentality with them. But when you look at the curriculum of a lot of these courses,
Progressive farming.
When you start to look at what they're actually teaching, they're teaching a lot of community values along with pure technical training in agriculture. And what they're not really doing, they're not providing missionaries with information about the latest, greatest fertilizer. They're teaching missionaries about how to promote family life. They're teaching missionaries about how to raise goats in rural China to try to provide a sort of basic sort of subsistence level of improvement. So there's sort of a window of time in the 20s, 30s, 40s where land-grant universities are doing agrarian things. They're thinking about communities while they are also promoting agricultural science and agricultural engineering, because those fields really start to emerge in the 1920s as well, which contributes to the industrialization. So it's a little bit more shades of gray than a lot of scholars have tended to talk about universities as. Yes?
I was curious, what places did you find helpful in terms of finding your sources? Did you go to a lot of local source bases, or did you go to more denominational affiliated archives?
I tended to work more with the denominational level archives. I spent a lot of time at the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia, the Methodist Archives in New Jersey, where they also have records of things like the National Council of Churches. I sort of accepted the fact that I was doing a largely top-down kind of study of the leaders of this movement, the mentalities, the philosophies of the movement as a whole. I didn't do a lot of sort of on-the-ground localized studies. The Lord's Acre movement is probably the place where I got the closest to, real farmers and real churches and people on the ground. Those archives are in North Carolina at a university down there. But it was primarily the denominational level, organizational level collections. Yes?
I have a question just about the beginning of the lecture. You said that farming began to decline when their products weren't needed anymore. And I was just thinking, what happened at the war where all of a sudden the same food wasn't needed? I just want you to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, part of the problem is that before and during World War I, a large percentage of what American farms were producing in terms of commodity crops, the wheat, the corn, a lot of that commodity crop production was being sent overseas. It was being purchased by Europe. It was being purchased by Russia. And some of those linkages are severed by the war. Russia stops purchasing anything from the United States as a result of World War I. And so the international market really drops off at that point. The domestic market is, yes, largely similar, but the international trade is definitely disrupted by the war.
And this is a book you have, right? That you
It
showed
is,
a picture of
yes.
the beginning, but you don't have any here today.
I don't myself.
We don't, because Oxford University Press, in estimating the price, has taken the price of platinum out of standard. And we didn't think we'd sell a lot out here at that rate. It is available on Amazon.
Yes, absolutely. I apologize about the price.
That's no responsibility.
Yes.
Oh, I have another question. I'm curious how Christian agrarians by the mid-century interpreted suburbanization, or did they even speak on it?
That's a good question. I didn't see a lot of specific discussion. I think a lot of agrarians had a fairly pragmatic view of their position in these changes. They knew that they weren't going to stop something like suburbanization. Certainly the way of life that was typical of suburbia in the 1950s and onward is contrary to a lot of what agrarians believed in, and certainly the loss of farmland to suburbanization was a huge problem. That's something they talk about a lot. But they certainly don't, at least from what I've seen, they don't have any sense that they probably can stop it from happening. Yeah.
You talked about, how these Christian agrarians didn't really fit into the anti-capitalist agrarian side of things, and I was just wondering if there's any dialogues or exchanges between kind of groups like the authors of I'll Take My Stand and these Christian agrarians who are more in favor of capitalism.
Yeah, that's a good question. And for a lot of people will think of something like I'll Take My Stand, which was a sort of Southern manifesto produced at Vanderbilt University by a group that called themselves, the Southern Agrarians. That's what comes to mind for a lot of people when they hear the term. The connections between them and these people are, in a lot of cases, fairly tenuous. They disavow a lot of what the Nashville Agrarians stood for. The Nashville Agrarians, I don't think you could, it would be hard to put them in that sort of social gospel mentality, because they really wanted to turn the clock back to what the South especially had been before the Civil War. And that's not something that these mainline Protestants have much interest in doing. They want to embrace modernity. They want it to be a rural modernity, but they want to look forward, not backwards.
So this seems to be a typically American thing. What happened that England didn't need agrarianism, or they already had it? Or?
In some ways, they already had it. England went through, and I will not claim to be an expert on what was going on in England or in Europe, but England had sort of experienced some of these stresses a little bit earlier, when common land had begun to be appropriated and enclosed, and land was being broken up into individual personal holdings. That had happened earlier than these changes. At least in England, it seems like the agrarian response is more about private property and ownership of land and less about these industrial changes. I can't really speak to what was going on in continental Europe, but in England at least it's Catholic agrarianism that is maybe a little stronger. Catholic agrarians in the United States are looking back to people like G.K. Chesterton in England who are writing about these topics a little bit earlier.
I'm just going to ask you one final question,
Yes.
if I may. So many of the movements you're talking about are obviously based in the South in the great age of segregation.
Yes.
Talk about some of the maybe the racial implications of some of these movements.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think in a lot of cases, the agrarians that I write about would have wanted to have produced an interracial movement, but in many cases they do not. The agrarian projects that take place, especially in the South, they tend to be segregated. White ministers work with white churches, white missionaries go to white churches, and black churches are separate. Agrarianism in general was not as popular among African Americans as it was among these mainline white churches. Black progressives, I think, had a hard time trying to encourage black farmers to stay on the land because for so long African Americans had been forced to stay on the land and forced to stay in things like sharecropping when in fact they wanted a very different situation. So there are places where black and white agrarians work together. These training programs in universities are actually one of them. You know, sometimes they actually have interracial pastors' institutes and missionary institutes. For the most part, they work very separately, and that's most likely a recognition simply of the state of affairs at the times and not necessarily their best intention. Yes.
Sorry. I'm an undergrad studying poli-sci, and I'm interested in agricultural reform.
Mhm.
So I wanted to know, because this is kind of a dialogue between private and public management of a resource,
Mhm.
Current day Christian agrarians, are they open to federal regulation on agricultural movements, or would they prefer state? Would they prefer none? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I have a great sense of what groups today would necessarily argue. I would imagine that there are probably a lot of challenges today in making these types of connections between church and state that were not as challenging in the early 20th century. Those separations were just not as strict in the time that I'm writing about. I wouldn't really be able to suggest what exactly the typical perspectives today are, I'm afraid.
You know, in a conversation at lunch today, one point emerged, which is you have these newer Christian agrarian movements, and they're discovering these ideas of conservation and sustainability, and they think they're taking it from the secular environmentalism of the 60s and 70s, which in turn was taking these ideas from earlier and now forgotten Christian movements, which is one of these great historical ironies, and the one which maybe we see in more areas of thought than we often give credit for. I want to thank Kevin Lowe for an excellent, very provocative presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.